The owners of most industrial businesses aim for double-digit growth. But each year, because of a simple design flaw, they end up settling for single digits. I'm going to take you on a journey back to the 1950s to highlight the design flaw that's most likely limiting your business to single-digit growth. On our journey, we'll stop in on Ray Kroc prior to his adventure with McDonald's. And then we'll visit the Xerox Corporation, where we'll find the solution to your growth problem hiding in plain sight. But before we climb into our little time machine, let's agree on why it makes sense to pursue double-digit growth. In my experience, the difference between single-digit growth and double digits is the difference between a workforce on cruise control versus an energized organization. It's the difference between steady profits for the owners versus surplus cash flow that can be used to fund innovation in the pursuit of even more aggressive growth. And it's the difference, ultimately, between being acquired versus being the acquirer. There's a reason I want to take you back to the 1950s. This was a decade where a fundamental change in the relationship between companies and their customers came into sharp focus. This change resulted in the traditional design of an organization's front of house being replaced with an entirely new model. But as I've hinted already, this change, fundamental though it was, has basically been ignored for the last 60 years. 1954 was the year that Ray Kroc sold a milkshake machine to the first McDonald's restaurant in California. If you've seen that 2016 movie, The Founder, you'll remember Ray Kroc lugging machines from restaurant to restaurant, demoing those machines in the hopes of securing orders. This is a pretty accurate representation of the 1950s sales department. Back then, there was a simple division of responsibilities between production and sales. In the case of Prince Castle, where Ray Kroc worked, the production department manufactured multi-mixers, and the sales department was responsible for selling them. Production folks were responsible for product, and salespeople were responsible for revenue. Now, by making Ray Kroc responsible for revenue, Prince Castle ensured that Ray Kroc became their customer's primary interface with the organization, which is to say, Ray Kroc was Prince Castle's front of house. It may not seem significant now, but I'd like you to remember that point. By making a salesperson responsible for revenue, Prince Castle guaranteed that that salesperson would become their organization's front of house. Of course, Ray Kroc and his relationship with the McDonald brothers would turn out to be transformative, but that's a different story. The transformation I want to highlight here occurred at the end of that decade. In 1959, on the other coast of America, Xerox introduced its pay-per-copy proposition along with a revolutionary 914 copier. This copier was 100 times faster than the average copier at the time, but it was expensive, really expensive. The pay-per-copy proposition allowed Xerox to sell copying as a service. Just 4 cents a copy. This made copiers affordable, and it catapulted Xerox into a position of absolute market dominance, a position it held until it was forced to license its patent portfolio in the 70s. Now consider pay-per-copy from a Xerox salesperson's perspective. With this proposition, the salesperson was no longer directly responsible for revenue as they were with the traditional capital equipment sale. The salesperson was essentially responsible for selling a service, and revenue was a product of that service, not directly a product of the salesperson's endeavors. With pay-per-copy, there were now 2 classes of transaction. There was the sale of the service, and then there was the sale that occurred every time someone pressed the copy button. The first class of transaction generated a signed contract, but no revenue. It was the second class of transaction that generated revenue. Suddenly, it was no longer correct to say that the Xerox salesperson generated revenue. The salesperson sold the copier, and the copier generated revenue. Now, it would be tempting to say that this is a distinction without a difference, but to draw this conclusion would be to ignore the ugly truth about the Xerox 914 copier. As anyone who had the pleasure of working in an office in the 20th century will attest, photocopiers were frequently broken. It was common for a queue of office workers to form, waiting for the Xerox technician to finish dragging crumpled sheets of copy paper from that labyrinth of rollers inside the machine. If there was a person at Xerox who directly influenced revenue, it was most certainly not the salesperson, it was the field technician. It turns out that Xerox didn't just invent the modern copier. Xerox also pioneered the modern approach to field technical support. From the Xerox customer's perspective, the field technician was now their primary interface with the organization, not the salesperson. In fact, I'm pretty sure if you asked any Xerox customer last century who from Xerox they would most like to visit them, they'd answer, without hesitation, a technician. So on our journey back to the 1950s, I introduced you to two technologies and the responsibilities of the salespeople who sold them. In the case of the milkshake machine, Ray Kroc sold them for the Prince Castle Corporation, and he was directly responsible for the generation of revenue. But in the case of the Xerox 914 copier, salespeople sold a service that incorporated the copier, but they were not directly responsible for the generation of revenue. I have a question for you. Which of these cases is more relevant to the modern industrial sales environment? What do you think? My answer is both, or perhaps neither. In the modern industrial sales environment, we sell propositions that are more similar to the Xerox one. However, we maintain sales departments that look just like the one that employed Ray Kroc back when he was selling milkshake machines. And this is why your organization is stuck on single-digit growth. I'm going to explain at length how to fix that problem. But first, let me fortify the claim I just made. After all, unless you feel my position's warranted, there's no value in my proposed solution. The first part of my claim is that industrial organizations today sell propositions that are more similar to the Xerox one. My assertion is that over time, technologies transition from being sold as discrete products to being sold as services. This is obviously the case with the photocopier. Also, things like electricity generation and computing infrastructure. But it's less obvious if we consider more mundane technologies like nuts and bolts or toilet paper. But if you think about it, in a business context, we don't make discrete purchases of commodity products like nuts and bolts or toilet paper. We might pay for them discreetly, but we enter into a commercial relationship with a supplier we trust to provide these and perhaps hundreds of similar products. In the case of nuts and bolts, that supplier might be Grainger or Fastenal. In the case of toilet paper, it might be Staples. We might audit those suppliers periodically to ensure their prices remain fair, but for the most part, discrete commodity purchases are programmatic. This means that today, salespeople do not, for the most part, directly influence revenue. The role of salespeople should be to sell the overarching commercial relationships from which revenue will flow. However, and this brings me to the second part of my claim, most sales departments are structured today as if salespeople are directly responsible for generating revenue. In fact, if you ask business owners and executives which of their departments is responsible for revenue, the answer is always the same: the sales department. And if you look at how salespeople are compensated, in almost every case, salespeople's incomes are tied to the revenue that emerges on a month-to-month basis from those accounts they've won historically. Now this sounds harmless enough, right? But let me expose the folly of this hybrid approach with one simple question. Are you ready? What do you think would have happened in the late 1950s if Xerox had made their salespeople directly responsible for photocopier revenue? That's right, in short order, all of their salespeople would have devolved into highly paid service technicians, and before long, no one would have been selling copiers. Even with Xerox's best-in-class fleet of field technicians, if Xerox was silly enough to make salespeople directly responsible for revenue, their salespeople would have proceeded en masse to the nearest hardware store to kit themselves out with wrenches, rubber gloves, and multimeters. Do you see where I'm going with this? In the modern industrial organization, salespeople are still directly responsible for revenue, and consequently, they have devolved over time into highly paid, field-based providers of technical services. The modern industrial salesperson is a salesperson in name only. They are part customer service rep, part technical specialist, part project manager, and part trainer. The only connection most have to sales is a sense of guilt they experience as they drive home each day. By making your salespeople responsible for revenue, you've made salespeople your primary customer interface, your front of house. And by making salespeople your front of house, you've consigned your organization to single-digit growth. Before we talk about the solution to this problem, we need to have a frank and honest discussion about revenue. I've hinted at what I'm about to tell you, but this is so important it really needs to be stated explicitly. Truth number one, salespeople do not generate revenue. Salespeople, when they're effective, generate commercial relationships, and commercial relationships generate revenue. Now, commercial relationships, when they're established, are often accompanied by an order. That order is only significant because it's evidence of the new commercial relationship. The revenue associated with that order is incidental. Truth number two, operations, not sales, does generate revenue. Make no mistake, revenue is important. You need it. You need it to make payroll. You need it to invest in new product development and innovation. And you and your fellow shareholders need it to fund your rock and roll lifestyles. So revenue is critically important, but it doesn't come from the sales department. It comes from operations. If you're not sure I'm correct, do this simple test. Make a list of the last 10 customers who defected and took their business to a competitor. Review each case and determine why each left. My guess is they all defected for one of 3 reasons. Either they're unhappy with your delivery performance, or they're unhappy with your pricing, or they're unhappy with your product or range of products, perhaps. These are the standard 3 reasons why industrial organizations lose customers: delivery performance, pricing, and product. And all are the direct responsibility of operations. Salespeople do not control any of these. Truth number 3. In economic terms, customer relationships or accounts are annuities. This is an important concept. An annuity is a series of future payments. From your bank's perspective, the mortgage they sold you is an annuity. If you have a rental property, the agreement you have with your tenant is an annuity. And when Xerox sold the 914 copier, those 4-cent transactions were an annuity. Because it's inconvenient for your customers to change suppliers frequently, switching cost, each of your customer relationships is an annuity, regardless of whether or not the relationship is codified with a contract. In fact, if you have a decent-sized basket of accounts, the law of large numbers enables you to make pretty accurate predictions about the purchasing behavior of a typical account. Truth number 4. The value of an account is inversely proportional to its cumulative spend. So if in economic terms an account is an annuity, it turns out there's a formula you can use to calculate its value. It's called the net present value calculation. Basically, net present value is the sum of future payments discounted back to today's dollars. Unfortunately, few executives have bothered to calculate the net present value of a typical account. I say unfortunately because if you do the math, you're likely to get a pleasant surprise. A new account that spends just a few $1,000s a month will most likely have a net present value in the tens of thousands of dollars. And that's assuming you do your calculations based on contribution margin, not revenue. However, as time passes and potential revenue is converted into actual revenue, the economic value of the account actually reduces. This means that an account is worth the most the day it's won, even though the account has not yet generated a single dollar in revenue. If there was a number that you should be celebrating in your sales department, it's the net present value of new business won, not the monthly revenue receipts. Of course, this is the exact opposite of how every industrial organization conceptualizes the contribution their sales department makes to the enterprise. And this fundamental misunderstanding of sales results in a litany of bad decisions. In fact, it wouldn't hurt to count them. Number 1, we hold salespeople accountable for revenue, even though they don't directly influence it, and even though this distracts them from the pursuit of new business. Number 2, we pay them commissions based on revenue, which focuses them even more sharply on exactly the set of behaviors we don't want them to engage in. Number 3, we under-resource operations based on the assumption that salespeople should be responsible for revenue. Number 4, we miscalculate the value of new business and consequently we underinvest in the growth of our enterprises. These are significant problems that emerge from a casual disregard for the fundamental nature of an industrial organization. This disregard almost rises to the level of fraud. But you don't have to worry, you're not going to do hard time. This is a fraud you're committing against yourself. Fortunately, this problem is pretty easy to fix, in theory. It's a little more complicated in practice. In theory, we begin by updating our starting assumption. We recognize that salespeople do not directly generate and should not be held accountable for revenue. This means that operations must accept responsibility for revenue, and this forces us to rethink the design of our organization. In Ray Kroc's time, the Prince Castle organization looked kind of like this. In the back of house, you had production, making stuff. Then in the front of house, facing the customer, you had the sales department generating revenue. There are 2 important points here. First, we're looking at a single process. Prince Castle manufactures a machine, Ray Kroc sells it. Second, sales and the front of house are synonymous. The Prince Castle salesperson is the organization's customer interface. But now, if we visualize a Xerox model, both of these things change. Where previously we had 1 process, we now have 2. And the salesperson is no longer the customer's primary interface with the organization. You can see that I've replaced production with operations. Operations is the value chain that stretches from the receipt of an order to fulfillment. So it includes production, along with customer service, purchasing, logistics, and so on. In the Xerox model, operations is fully responsible for the generation of revenue. Within operations, you have some departments that are customer-facing, customer service and technical support, for example. And of course, we still have purchasing, production, and logistics in the back of house. So the first process is the process that generates revenue, and operations is responsible for that entire process. The second process is the process that generates new business, and that is the sole responsibility of sales. Now, these are two discrete processes, which is to say that sales has minimal dependence on operations and vice versa. This loose coupling between sales and operations is the critical attribute of the Xerox model. And if you want to shift your organization from single to double-digit growth, you must redesign your sales function in line with the Xerox model, which means you must ensure that your sales function is loosely coupled with operations. A moment ago, I said that the design flaw was easy to fix in theory, more difficult in practice. The key to fixing this problem in practice is to understand the notion of loose coupling. For a perfect example of two processes loosely coupled within the one system, consider a cyclist on a modern bicycle with a freewheeling gear set. The cyclist can stand in the saddle and sprint, causing the bicycle to accelerate. But if he tires, returns to his saddle and stops pedaling, the bicycle continues to travel at its new, higher velocity. The relationship between the cyclist and the bicycle is exactly the relationship you need to create between your sales department and operations. Sales is the cyclist who stands and sprints. Operations is the bicycle that remains in motion thanks to inertia. And of course, the motion itself is revenue. To achieve this special relationship, you must make operations self-sufficient with respect to revenue generation. By self-sufficient, I mean that if your customers have an inclination to purchase from you, and they know roughly what it is that they want, then they should be able to transact with your organization without any involvement from salespeople. This means that your operations group should be able to receive inbound inquiries, design solutions, generate proposals, process orders, onboard new customers, and resolve any issues that arise along the way. If you achieve this level of transactional self-sufficiency, then, and only then, are you in a position to insist that your sales department focuses exclusively on the pursuit of new business. By the way, when I say that sales should focus on new business, I mean new customers and new categories of business for existing customers. Operations should be responsible for incremental growth or growth within existing categories. This is because customer spend within categories is primarily a function of operational performance. Okay, we'll get to sales in a minute. First, let me walk you through the 4 changes you'll need to make to your operations group to get to transactional self-sufficiency. There's a basic trifecta of transactional tasks you need to perform efficiently in order to bank your customers' money and keep it banked. You need to generate quotes, you need to process orders, and you need to answer questions and resolve issues as they arise. Your customer service team needs the capability and the capacity to perform 100% of these tasks. And then it needs protective capacity in reserve to ensure that it can still perform them at the end of a busy month with a couple of operators off sick at a faster rate and to a higher standard than salespeople currently perform them. Realistically, to achieve this, you will need to stop dividing up work for your customer service team by geography, product line, and client, and build one large frontline team of generalist customer service reps. You will then need to support this generalist team with a second tier of experts who can perform tasks that are too large or too complex to be performed by the Tier 1 generalists. With this structure, you should be able to make it significantly easier and faster for customers to transact with you. In industrial organizations, there's often effort associated with the onboarding of new business. This might entail mapping a customer's previous purchases to your stock items and delivering training. Or it might involve integrations between enterprise systems, or even the installation of equipment or people in your customers' locations. Whatever the requirements, this work cannot be done by your customer service team. At a minimum, you should have one or more coordinators who specialize in managing customer onboarding. Or, if the level of effort justifies it, you should build a self-contained onboarding team. It's amazing and shocking that many industrial organizations boast about the quality of technical support they provide their customers. But then when you scratch beneath the surface, and trust me, I've done a lot of scratching, you discover that these organizations have no engineering team. This means one of two things. Either salespeople are currently masquerading as engineers, or these organizations actually have engineers on their sales team, in which case they have engineers masquerading as salespeople. Neither, believe it or not, is optimal. A better approach is to put the organization's most technically adept individuals into a central team. If you're struggling to find a name for this department, you might consider engineering, perhaps? Your new engineering department will provide technical services to customers and potential customers at the behest of both your customer service and sales teams. And this department can be managed by a professional head of engineering who presumably will be quite keen to scale both the quantity and the quality of services provided. Now, it may be that you're a manufacturer and you already have an engineering department. If so, you should ensure that this department is split into two teams. Production engineering is production-facing and is concerned with the delivery of orders that have already been won. And design engineering is customer-facing, specializing in the design of solutions. You should never have production and design engineering tasks performed by a pooled engineering team, because these tasks are performed at a materially different cadence and a materially different level of resolution. Many industrial salespeople call themselves account managers. In most cases, this is a bit of an exaggeration. When you remove the tasks that are now performed by customer service, onboarding, and engineering, most customers have no additional requirements. But not all. There are some customers whose vendor relationships are complex enough that they benefit from a kind of concierge service that transcends the day-to-day transactional tasks. If you have customers who would benefit from such a service, you should certainly provide it. And account manager is a sensible title for the person who performs this role. But be careful here. Because your account managers are primarily engaged in the generation of revenue, they are part of your operations group, not sales. They will, however, generate a steady stream of sales opportunities that can be fed to your sales team. The changes to operations I've detailed add up to a significant restructure in most industrial organizations. But these are low-risk, high-value changes that probably should have been made decades ago. Almost all organizations report an immediate uptick in revenues. A cynical observer might interpret this as evidence that customers never really cared that much about long walks on the beach with salespeople. They just wanted their stuff. But sarcasm aside, the result of these changes is that your organization is now so much easier to deal with. And your salespeople now have absolutely nothing to do with their time other than to pursue new business. You might assume that if you were to remove all the distractions from salespeople, that they would automatically embark on a quest for new business. The truth is that there are two changes you need to make within the sales department before salespeople will start to drive the growth that you're looking for. The first thing you need to do is move your core sales team inside. It turns out that the lion's share of effort that needs to be expended in order to win new business is expended on the phone or in video conferences, not face-to-face with potential customers. Furthermore, of the conversations that do need to be performed face-to-face, most of them are technical in nature, most commonly what's called detailed requirement discovery, meaning that they should be performed by members of your design engineering team, not by salespeople. Now, it's true that there is a small number of high-value selling conversations that do need to be performed in the field, particularly where large deals are concerned. But you should not have members of your core sales team perform these conversations. It's better to have a small number of highly capable enterprise salespeople who travel and perform these meetings on behalf of the general sales team. In a smaller organization, members of your executive team can fill this role. The reality is that the days of sales as primarily a field-based activity are long gone, and they're never coming back. The design of your sales function needs to reflect this reality. Salespeople should be well compensated, professional people who sit inside, ideally in one central location, and spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week engaged in selling conversations. That's 8 hours a day, 5 days a week per person engaged in the relentless pursuit of new business, new accounts, and new categories for existing accounts. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how you're going to shift from single to double-digit growth. Wait. I know you've just seen the light, but there's one more piece to this puzzle that needs to drop into place before your organization starts growing again. It's true that double-digit growth will come from a small team of salespeople dedicating 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to the pursuit of new business. But that adds up to a lot of selling conversations. And for those selling conversations to occur, your salespeople will need a lot of sales opportunities. From where, you might ask, will these opportunities come? It turns out that question's a little tricky to answer. It depends on your definition of sales opportunity, or what salespeople call leads. Your sales team would like you to define a sales opportunity as a potential customer with both the means and the intent to purchase. This highly limiting definition might have been excusable when your salespeople were busy looking after existing accounts. But if you sanction this definition, then I have bad news for you. You will never be able to generate sales opportunities at the rate necessary to achieve double-digit growth. However, If you define sales opportunity as simply a competitor's existing customer, then you're in luck. Sales opportunities are abundant. I would encourage you to mandate the second definition. Now you know what a sales opportunity is. All you need to do is assemble a bunch of them and maintain a queue of these opportunities upstream from each of your salespeople. And now, your salespeople can busy themselves on the relentless pursuit of these opportunities. The maintenance of salespeople's opportunity queues should be the responsibility of your marketing department. My advice is to divide marketing into two teams. You have your existing marketing communications team, and then you have a small promotions team whose sole reason for existence is the daily replenishment of salespeople's opportunity queues. I think it's worth pausing here for a moment and reflecting on what you've achieved. You've transferred the responsibility for revenue to your operations group, which is to say that operations is now responsible for what you used to call account management. You've made marketing responsible for the daily replenishment of salespeople's opportunity queues, and you now have a small team of internal salespeople who dedicate themselves to the relentless pursuit of new business. Relative to the organization you had prior to these changes, your customers are now enjoying a higher level of service, and you are pursuing new business at probably 10 times your previous rate. Bravo! But before we're done here, there are two loose ends that need to be identified and neatly knotted. The first is the subject of cold calling. You may have already realized that if you define a sales opportunity as a competitor's existing customer, then you're expecting your salespeople to pick up the phone and talk to strangers. This is what salespeople call cold calling, and salespeople hate cold calling. Well, I agree with salespeople on their dislike for cold calling, but I disagree on the definition. What makes a telephone call cold is not the absence of a pre-existing relationship, it's the absence of a compelling proposition. After all, if your salespeople took to regularly calling family and friends with Amway pitches, it wouldn't take long for those calls to turn a little chilly. So yes, your salespeople need to be prepared to talk to strangers, but your executive team has to provide your salespeople with compelling propositions so as to ensure that their selling conversations are reasonably productive. And this brings us full circle back to Prince Castle and Xerox in the 50s. It turns out there's two kinds of compelling proposition. There's new technology like Prince Castle's multi-mixer, or there's a service wrapper around existing technology like Xerox's paper print proposition. It's outside the scope of our little discussion here today to talk about how to generate a compelling proposition. But if you don't have one, it should be a priority, and it must be the responsibility of your organization's most senior people. The second loose end is an uncomfortable question with a surprisingly comforting answer. The question is, what will become of your existing salespeople? Not surprisingly, few of them will be comfortable with the idea of surrendering their car keys, moving inside and donning a headset. Salespeople's discomfort with this idea should be shared by the executive team. After all, in most industrial organizations, salespeople have years of experience and technical knowledge that would be a huge loss to the organization were it to walk out the door. The key to resolving this dilemma is to recognize that your legacy salespeople are performing valuable roles today as quasi-members of your operations group. What you want to do is move your legacy salespeople into those roles within operations that most closely resemble the actual activities they're performing today. If some salespeople spend most of their time solving technical problems and designing solutions, make them members of your engineering team. If some salespeople enjoy managing the complexities associated with major accounts, then make them account managers. And if you have salespeople who enjoy logistics, then maybe they should be the founding members of your new onboarding team. What many organizations do is create a hybrid role called field specialist. These are semi-technical folks with a decent understanding of commercials who spend almost all their time in the field, performing discrete tasks at the behest of both the sales and the customer service teams. Not surprisingly, many industrial salespeople find that this field specialist role enables them to enjoy the best elements of their previous sales role without the less desirable elements, and definitely without that sense of guilt as they drive home each day. So you now understand how to redesign your organization so you can comfortably generate double-digit growth year after year. The proximate cause of this growth will be your salespeople, who are now focused exclusively on the pursuit of new business. But I think you understand now that this desirable end result cannot be achieved by edict alone. It requires a new understanding of revenue. It requires a recalibration of responsibilities across your sales and operations groups. And most importantly, it requires a purposeful and carefully orchestrated restructuring of your entire front of house. The journey you're about to embark on isn't easy, but it's necessary, it's overdue, and the upside is significant. If you'd like to explore these ideas in greater detail, you might like to go to Amazon and grab a copy of my book, The Machine. And it probably wouldn't hurt to share this video with members of your executive team. How about we agree, you and me, that last year will be the last year that you booked single-digit growth. Going forward with your re-engineered front of house, double digits.